In 2015, the small town of Ripley, West Virginia, was shaken to its core by a crime so horrific it defied comprehension. The tragic death of 10-month-old Emmaleigh Barringer exposed the darkest side of domestic violence and betrayal. This is the heartbreaking story of a life taken too soon, the relentless pursuit of justice, and a community's fight to ensure such a tragedy never happens again.
It was the early morning hours of October 3, 2015, in the small, close-knit town of Ripley, West Virginia. At 5 a.m., emergency services received a frantic call from a distressed family reporting that 10-month-old Emmaleigh Barringer was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived at the Barringer residence on Meadowlark Lane to find a horrifying scene that would haunt the community forever. Emmaleig's mother, Amanda Adkins, had discovered her baby lying lifeless and bruised. The toddler was rushed to the hospital, but doctors quickly determined that her injuries were severe and beyond recovery. She was pronounced dead later that day, and an investigation was immediately launched to uncover what had happened in the early hours of that fateful morning. Suspicion quickly fell on Amanda's boyfriend, Benjamin Taylor, a 32-year-old man who had been living in the home with Amanda and her children. Taylor had a troubling history of substance abuse and erratic behavior, which had caused tension within the household. On the night of Emmaleig's death, Taylor had been left alone with the child while Amanda slept in another room. Investigators combed through the home, finding damning evidence in the laundry room, where Taylor had taken Emmaleigh. Bloodstains and signs of a struggle indicated that the baby had been violently assaulted. The autopsy later confirmed the unthinkable. Emmaleigh had been sexually assaulted and suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Taylor was arrested at the scene after inconsistencies in his account of the night's events raised red flags. He initially denied any involvement, claiming he had no idea how Emmaleigh had been injured. However, his evasive behavior and physical evidence tying him to the crime left no doubt in the minds of investigators. Forensic analysis revealed Taylor's DNA on the baby's body, further solidifying his role in the horrific act. Police also discovered that Taylor had attempted to wash away evidence by cleaning himself and the area where the assault occurred. His actions demonstrated a calculated effort to cover his tracks, which only deepened the gravity of his crime. The case quickly made headlines, shocking the nation with its brutality. Vigils were held in Ripley, where residents mourned the loss of a baby who had barely begun her life. The community, known for its warmth and unity, grappled with the incomprehensible act committed in their midst. Taylor's arrest was a small comfort to Emmaleig's grieving family, who struggled to come to terms with the loss. Amanda Adkins publicly expressed her devastation, blaming herself for trusting Taylor and leaving him alone with her children. Her anguish became a symbol of the broader pain felt by the community. Meanwhile, the Jackson County Sheriff's Department worked tirelessly to build a rock-solid case against Taylor. They interviewed neighbors and family members, piecing together his troubled past and erratic behavior leading up to the crime. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and prosecutors prepared for what they knew would be a harrowing trial. The trial of Benjamin Taylor began in April 2017 at the Jackson County Courthouse in Ripley, West Virginia. From the outset, it was clear that emotions ran high, with the courtroom filled with family members, community residents, and journalists. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that Taylor's actions were premeditated and deserving of the harshest punishment available. The prosecution meticulously presented evidence, starting with the forensic findings that tied Taylor directly to the crime scene. Graphic details about the assault were revealed, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Witnesses testified about Taylor's violent tendencies and erratic behavior, painting a picture of a man who had spiraled out of control. Amanda Adkins, Emmaleig's mother, took the stand in one of the most emotional moments of the trial. She recounted the horrific discovery of her daughter and described the trust she had placed in Taylor, only for it to be betrayed in the most devastating way. Her testimony brought many in the courtroom to tears and underscored the profound loss felt by the family. Taylor's defense team attempted to argue that he was under the influence of drugs and alcohol at the time of the crime, claiming he was not in full control of his actions. They presented witnesses who testified about his history of addiction and mental health struggles, hoping to evoke some measure of sympathy from the jury. Despite the defense's efforts, the overwhelming evidence left little room for doubt. Prosecutors highlighted Taylor's calculated attempts to clean up the scene and evade responsibility, arguing that his actions demonstrated a clear understanding of his guilt. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. On June 5, 2017, Benjamin Taylor was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described his actions as monstrous and emphasized that the sentence reflected the gravity of the crime. For the residents of Ripley, the verdict brought a measure of closure, though the scars of the tragedy remained. In the aftermath, the community rallied around Amanda Adkins and her surviving children. Fundraisers and memorials were held in Emmaleig's honor, with proceeds going to support victims of child abuse and their families. The case also sparked conversations about domestic violence and child protection, with many advocating for stricter background checks on caregivers. Amanda, despite her grief, became an outspoken advocate for child safety. She worked with local organizations to raise awareness about the signs of abuse and the importance of vigilance in protecting children. Her strength and resilience inspired others to turn their pain into action. The murder of Emmaleigh Barringer left an indelible mark on Ripley, West Virginia. The case served as a somber reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in trusted relationships. Through the efforts of law enforcement, the justice system, and a grieving community, Emmaleig's memory was honored, and her story became a call to action. While nothing could undo the pain of losing Emmaleigh, the community found solace in the unity that arose from the tragedy. Her legacy lived on through the awareness campaigns and support systems established in her name, ensuring that her short life would leave a lasting impact.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into a really tough case, the murder of 10-month-old Emmaleigh Barringer. It happened in Ripley, West Virginia, back in 2015. I know, it's going to be rough, but I think it's important we talk about it, so we can learn from it and try to prevent these things from happening again. I've got an expert here with us today.
Yeah, these cases, they're always hard, but they remind us that there are real people, real families affected by this.
Right, so let's go back. October 3rd, 2015, Ripley, West Virginia, small town, early morning, 5:00 a.m. A call goes out to emergency services.
Those early calls are always the worst. You never know what you're going to find.
And in this case, well, they found baby Emmaleigh. She wasn't responding. There were signs of trauma. Her mother, Amanda Adkins, was just devastated. Naturally, the investigation starts, and they quickly turn their attention to Benjamin Taylor. He was the boyfriend, the last one alone with Emmaleigh.
That was a tough job for investigators in these cases, right? Trying to figure out what happened. Was it an accident or was it something much worse?
And Taylor had a history. Substance abuse, erratic behavior. Doesn't mean he's guilty, but it definitely raises some questions. What are investigators looking for in a situation like this?
Well, first you look for signs of a struggle. Anything that doesn't add up in the stories you're hearing. And of course, forensic evidence.
Right. And in Emmaleig's case, the laundry room becomes a key part of the investigation. What was it about the laundry room?
That's where they found bloodstains. Signs that someone tried to clean up.
Yeah.
All those indicators that something awful happened. You know, the laundry room, it's a place for clean things, routine. And then to have something so horrific happen there, it's jarring.
And it got even worse when the autopsy results came back. Emmaleigh had been sexually assaulted, and she had blunt force trauma to the head. Can you explain what that means? Blunt force trauma?
It means she was hit with something hard. A heavy object, maybe? Or a very forceful impact. This wasn't an accident.
Right. And the more they investigated, the more the evidence pointed to Taylor. His story kept changing. And then the DNA evidence. They found his DNA on Emmaleig's body. How important is DNA evidence in these cases?
DNA evidence is often the most important thing. It's scientific, it's objective. It can back up what a witness says, or it can show that someone's lying.
So you've got Taylor trying to clean up, get rid of evidence. It seems like he's trying to hide what he did. What goes through an investigator's mind when they see that?
Well, investigators are trained to be objective, to focus on the facts. But they're still human. They see these things, and it affects them, especially when it's a child. It can be hard to handle.
Yeah.
But it also makes them more determined to get justice.
And this wasn't just a case for the investigators. This shook the entire town of Ripley. It's a small town. Everyone knows each other. What happens to a community when something like this happens?
Small towns rely on trust. Everyone feels safe because they know everyone else. When something like this happens, it breaks that trust. People get scared, angry.
And in Ripley, it was just devastating. Amanda Adkins, Emmaleig's mother, was just heartbroken. She blamed herself. You could just feel the pain. How does a parent even begin to cope with something like this?
It's one of the hardest things to deal with, not just the loss of a child, but the betrayal. That someone you trusted could do something like this. The guilt, the anger, the grief. It's overwhelming.
So the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, they're working the case, talking to neighbors, family, trying to piece together a picture of Taylor. How important is it to build a really strong case in a situation like this?
It's absolutely crucial. The community wants justice, and the prosecution has to prove that Taylor did it. There can't be any doubt.
And they did. They found a lot of evidence against him. Let's jump ahead now to April 2017. The trial begins. What was the atmosphere like in that courtroom?
Tense, I imagine. The family's there wanting justice, the community scared and angry, and the media trying to capture it all.
The prosecution was going for the death penalty. They argued that what Taylor did was planned, intentional. What makes a prosecutor decide to seek the death penalty?
It's not a decision they take lightly. They look at the brutality of the crime, how vulnerable the victim was, Taylor's past, whether he could be rehabilitated. In this case, Emmaleig's age, the assault, the cover-up. They probably saw all that as justification for the death penalty.
Right. Their strategy was to lay out the facts for the juror. The DNA evidence, the details of the assault, witness testimony that showed Taylor as a dangerous person. How often do they use that strategy? And does it work?
It's pretty common in these types of cases. The prosecution wants to tell a story that makes sense, that connects the evidence to the defendant. They want the jury to understand the severity of the crime. How well it works depends. How good the prosecution is, how strong the evidence is, and of course the jury has to decide.
And then there was Amanda Adkins. She had to get up there and testify, talk about what happened, about how Taylor betrayed her trust. Can you imagine how difficult that must have been for her?
It's incredibly hard for any victim to testify. But for a parent who's lost a child like this, it's unimaginable. But it's also important. Her testimony put a human face on the case, reminded everyone that this was a real family suffering a real loss.
Now, the defense had a tough job. They argued that Taylor was high and drunk, that he wasn't in control of himself. They brought in witnesses to talk about his addiction, his mental health, trying to make the jury feel sorry for him. Is that a common strategy? Does it ever work?
It happens a lot when there's a lot of evidence against the defendant. They're not saying he didn't do it. They're just saying he wasn't thinking straight. It's a risky strategy because you have to acknowledge the crime, but also try to minimize the blame. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
It's fascinating how these legal strategies play out. What do you think about this particular defense? How do you think the jury saw it?
Well, they tried to show that Taylor was struggling, that he had problems with addiction and mental health. But they didn't try to say he was innocent. It's hard to say how the jury felt about it. It depends on their own beliefs, how well the lawyers presented the case, and of course, how strong the prosecution's argument was. Cases like this, they really make you think about why. Why would someone do something so horrible to a child?
Yeah, it's hard to understand. What makes someone hurt a child like that?
It's complicated. There's no one reason, no easy answer. Sometimes it's mental illness. Sometimes it's because they were abused themselves. Drugs and alcohol can play a part. And sometimes it's just evil.
It's scary to think about. That someone you know could be capable of something like that. How do we protect kids from this? What can we do?
It's about being aware, paying attention, noticing if a child is being treated badly. If someone is always putting a child down, isolating them, if they get angry or violent with a child.
Those are some tough things to think about. But you're right. We need to be aware. So, back to the trial. The jury didn't believe the defense. They only took 2 hours to come back with a guilty verdict. Guilty on all charges. What does that tell you?
It tells me the evidence was very strong. The prosecution did a good job. The jury had no doubt that Taylor was guilty.
And then came the sentencing. June 5th, 2017. Taylor got life in prison. No parole. The judge called his actions monstrous. Did that bring closure to the community?
I think it brought a sense of justice, knowing that Taylor would never hurt another child. But true closure, after something this horrific. I don't know if that's possible.
This case brought up a lot of important issues. Domestic violence, child protection, background checks. Have there been any changes because of cases like Emmaleig's?
Yeah, definitely. There's more awareness about child abuse now, more people are reporting it, child protection services are getting better, and there's more funding for organizations that help victims and families.
That's good to hear. But there's still a long way to go, right?
Absolutely.
Emmaleig's case really affected people. The community rallied around Amanda Adkins and her other kids. They raised money, held memorials. What role does that kind of support play?
It's incredibly important. It shows the family that they're not alone, that people care. It helps them cope with the trauma and grief.
And Amanda Adkins has become an advocate for child safety, speaking out, raising awareness. Do a lot of victims or their families become advocates?
It's not uncommon. It can be a way to channel their grief into something positive, to try to prevent something like this from happening again. It takes a lot of strength and courage.
It does. It's inspiring to see. So what have we learned from Emmaleig's story about protecting children?
We've learned that it can happen anywhere, to any child. It doesn't matter what your family is like or where you live. We all have to be vigilant. We all have to watch out for kids.
So it's not just the police or social workers, it's all of us. What can we do to make a difference?
Educate yourself. Learn the signs of abuse. And if you see something, say something. Report it.
You might save a child's life.
And you might.
There are also resources for families who are struggling, right? Like parenting classes, support groups, things like that.
Absolutely.
How can we encourage people to use those resources?
We have to change the way we think about asking for help. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. We need to make it okay for parents to say they need help.
That's so important. What about communities? What can they do to support families?
Communities can create resource centers, places where families can get help with parenting, finances, counseling. Schools can provide information about resources, and faith-based organizations can offer support as well.
So it takes a village.
It really does.
And what about programs to help families before abuse happens?
Early intervention programs are crucial. They can help identify families who are at risk and provide support to prevent abuse from happening in the first place.
So what happened to Taylor after he was convicted?
He went to prison. Life sentence, no parole. He'll be in a maximum security facility for the rest of his life.
This case didn't just affect Emmaleigh and her family, it affected the whole town of Ripley. What are the long-term effects of a tragedy like this on a community?
Trauma like this can really damage a community. It breaks down trust. People become afraid. And in a small town where everyone knows each other, it's even harder. It's a constant reminder of what happened.
So how does a community heal from something like this?
It takes time. And it takes a lot of effort. People need to talk about what happened. They need to support each other. Community leaders, mental health professionals, faith groups, they all have a role to play.
So it's not about forgetting, it's about finding a way to move forward.
Exactly.
Have you seen communities do this well?
Yes, I have. Sometimes they create memorials or scholarships in the victim's name. They might organize events to raise awareness about child abuse. It's a way to honor the victim and try to prevent it from happening again.
This is a tough question, but I have to ask it. Can you forgive someone who does something like this? Is forgiveness even possible?
Forgiveness is personal. It's up to each individual. It doesn't mean you condone what happened, but it can help you let go of the anger and pain.
It's not easy.
No, it's not.
We've talked a lot about the terrible details of this case, but we also need to remember Emmaleigh and her family. How do we balance telling the story with respecting their privacy?
It's a difficult balance. We need to be sensitive. We shouldn't sensationalize the crime.
Yeah.
We should focus on the bigger issue of child abuse. And we should always remember that real people are hurting because of this.
Right. It's not just a story. This is a real tragedy.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important thing you want our listeners to remember?
I want them to remember that child abuse is preventable. We don't have to accept it. We can all do something to make a difference.
That's a good message. We can all do something.
We can.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll have some final thoughts and resources for our listeners. If you're struggling with anything we've talked about today, please reach out for help. There are people who care, and there are resources available. We'll be right back.
We're back. Emmaleig's story, it's hard to hear, but it's important.
Yeah, these cases, they stay with you.
What do you want our listeners to take away from this? What do you hope they remember?
I hope they remember that we can't ignore this. Child abuse happens, and we need to talk about it.
It's easy to feel helpless. Like, what can one person do?
You're right. But we can all do something.
Like what?
Little things. Educate yourself. Be there for families you know. Support policies that protect kids.
Small steps.
Exactly. Every step counts.
So where can our listeners go to learn more, to get involved?
There are some great organizations out there. The National Children's Alliance, for one. They have local chapters all over. They help victims and families.
Then there's Child Help USA. They have a hotline, 24/7. You can report abuse or get help for yourself or someone you know.
That's good to know. What about for sexual assault?
RATE-N, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. They support survivors, including children.
We'll put links to all of those in the show notes. You know, even though this is a tough story, there's still hope. The community came together. Amanda Adkins is fighting for change. People are working to protect children.
That's what keeps me going. Seeing people care, wanting to make a difference.
It's inspiring. Thank you for being here today, for sharing your expertise.
It was my pleasure. And to our listeners, one last thought. What will you do to protect children? To make the world a safer place for them? Even a small action can make a difference.
That's a great message to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. If anything we talked about today has been difficult for you, please reach out for help. You are not alone. We'll be back soon with another deep dive. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep fighting for a better world.